Hello, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. Ministers, priests, rabbis, imams, and religious leaders of all types of communities have many duties and challenges. They're the CEO of their institutions, teachers and preachers to their communities, and the public face of religion for their congregations. But they also do much important work behind the scenes, work known as congregational care. My guest today, the Reverend Jeff McClain, is Director of Congregational Care at Boone United Methodist Church, and he will help us understand the challenges facing religious leaders, particularly when they are working behind the scenes. Welcome, Jeff, if it's okay if I call you Jeff.
That'd be just fine.
Yeah. So I know that congregational care is not the only thing you do, but that's you're a minister of congregational care at your church. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and how you came to specialize, if you will, in congregational care, and maybe what congregational care is. Maybe we should start there.
Sure. So congregational care is making sure that everybody who is going through, I don't want to say it's not just as narrow as a crisis, but any kind of transition or change in their life, making sure that they are supported and cared for through that change.
Right.
So it could obviously include hospital stays or grief, dealing with grief and loss or divorce, but it could also be there's a new baby or you've adopted or there's some other life challenge, job change, career navigation, things like that. It can encompass a very broad spectrum of things.
Yeah, I think about the rituals that the church celebrates, and most of them, or many of them at least, are centered around these life changes. That's a good way to think about it. New babies and baptisms, new marriages and weddings, deaths and funerals. These are all, of course, very important transitions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what led you to focus on helping your flock, if you will, navigate these life transitions that range from very happy and momentous occasions to grief counseling?
I think one of the things, so I started off, in my undergrad, I studied computer engineering.
Good preparation
for ministry. Very natural progression into ministry, a lot of overlap there. And I loved it. It was a lot of fun. I have an analytical mind, but I also always just enjoy being present with people. And so even when I was working in the software world, I worked for a software company for several years and then did some consulting after that. Found that people would often come to me and say things like, "I can't believe I'm telling you this, but," and then tell me some very serious thing that was going on in their life, and found in me a willing and comfortable listening companion.
This might sound like a strange question, but do you think there's something about you that communicated to other people that you were a listening companion? You said that people come, even when you weren't in the role as minister, you'd find people coming to you to talk to you. Is there something in the vibe you give off that attracts people to you in that way?
That's a good question. My wife told me she would know she met her husband when she looked in his eyes and she could tell that was him. And she saw something in my eyes, in my heart, about my character and my disposition that told her, this is a good partner. And I wonder if there's not something similar in that other people see in me as just somebody who's trustworthy or willing to care or to listen.
Right. And I would imagine trustworthy, I think, is a good word, because trust has to be at the heart of what you do when people come to you with, particularly in a crisis situation or a troubling situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I certainly I get that about you, that you come across as a caring and empathetic person and a trustworthy person. So I was going to ask you if there were kind of particular talents that someone needs to have. So maybe talent isn't the right word. It might be more character traits that lends one to be an effective counselor or pastoral figure.
I think you have to know how to listen more than talk.
Right.
And that's a real challenge. Because especially if someone's coming to you to present you with a problem, many of us, our first inclination is to say, okay, well, I've heard what you said, let me tell you how to fix it.
Yeah.
That's not often what's most helpful,
right.
Believe it or not, for people who are experiencing crisis. Of course, you need to have some next steps and things like that, but oftentimes, I had somebody say to me once that they had a plaque on their that said, what people really need is a good listening to.
Instead of a good talking to. Yeah, that's really good.
And that describes my role well, I think.
Yeah.
I'm available to listen to people. And as you do that, people, and you listen in a way, I listen in a way that I try to make sure that they know that I'm listening, and I reflect some of the concerns that they have named, and I'll say things like, what I hear you saying is this, or it sounds like what you're saying is, and give them a chance to play back. And oftentimes what happens as they do that and as they reflect on it is they come to their own realization about what the next step should be.
Right. Something about hearing your own words repeated back to you.
Yeah.
Well, I brought some books from my own library today. I hadn't cracked these books in years. I was a divinity student in the early 80s, and I think back then pastoral care, as we called it, was relatively new in seminaries, at least, and we got the impression that this was something new and fresh. I got a couple of images, though, that we'll look at here on the screen, because the first one is a book by St. Gregory the Great, a pope from the 6th century.
That's not a recent hit.
No, it's not a recent hit, but it's a book that deals with the very thing we're talking about. What's the role of the minister in transition points in life? And then the second image, a more contemporary writer, but a very important person in the history of Christianity, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
Kind of a classic life together. Yeah. And it's not so much about pastoral care,
right,
but about the sorts of issues that people in community deal with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also got a couple of quotes. I wanted you maybe to react to them, and I think you've already almost read them ahead of time. The first one is, and you said something similar to this, my job is not to solve people's problems or make them happy, but to help them see grace operating in their lives. Is that a pretty accurate statement?
You couldn't have picked a better quote for me. I loved Eugene Peterson. He was very influential to me as a pastor, and I completely agree with that. I see that as, he calls it, see grace operating in their lives. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
I like to help people see what God might be up to
right
in their lives right now.
Okay. And the second quote I think has a little humorous edge to it. Once a seminary student asked to shadow me for 2 days to see what my life as a pastor was like. At the end he said, "Oh my gosh, you're basically a person for a living." There's that empathetic response, right?
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. How do you get trained to be a person? I mean, is there any special training that you had to go through in order to focus on the problems of people?
Right. So, of course, I was trained as a pastor. I have a master's in divinity. It was 92 credits worth of coursework that was designed to make me be able to be a pastor in a number of settings and situations. It might surprise some people to learn that I had one class in pastoral care and counseling. So of the 92 credits, three of those credits were in pastoral care and counseling. I think 3 of them were in writing sermons, 3 of those credits. And here's 2 things that when you think of a pastor, what do? Well, they preach sermons and they talk to people all the time.
Right.
Well, that was 6 of my 92 credits. So how do you get trained for it? Well, that's a good question. I think there has to be, with any vocation, you have to have some sense of, if you're going to do it well, you have to have some sense of calling to whatever it is. Right. So for me as a pastor, like I said, I had noticed that people wanted to talk to me. We're very comfortable doing that, and so that was almost kind of my pre-training to seminary. It was almost like a pre-affirmation. This is a good direction to go in. And of course, there's also there's nothing like experience either.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
I remember I had learned all about how to prepare for a funeral, but there was nothing like that call that I got that Sunday afternoon that somebody had suddenly passed away, and it was my job to respond in that situation. There's nothing like experience that'll prepare you to do that well.
Right. And of course, there's much more to preparing for a funeral than simply getting up and preaching the eulogy.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're with the family and you're helping them through a very difficult time.
Yeah.
And, so if I were in need of counseling for whatever reason, let's say I wanted marriage counseling, I guess I would have two options. I could go to my minister or the leader of my religious congregation, could be you, or I could seek out secular counseling. Is there I'm sure there is a difference. What would you say is the main difference between a minister as counselor and a secular counselor?
I think it's just it's a different frame of reference, obviously. Right? If you have the understanding of relationship as a gift from God, to be stewarded and cared for under God's guidance and supervision and input, that's a different starting place than just saying, "Hey, how's your life together?" Because it's not just about those two people. In Christian counseling, or at least in pastoral counseling that I do, we're asking, what is God up to? What is this third entity up to in the midst of your relationship? It's not just two, but it's you and God. And so, how do we incorporate God in what's happening here in your relationship? Even in the brokenness, where do we see God at work, and where might God be inviting us to seek healing through God rather than just with each other and in a more secular setting?
Right. So I guess it's really the perspective of the person who's seeking the help, whether or not they want to have it in that frame of reference that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you referenced something just a few minutes ago that got me to thinking. You said that the two main tasks of a minister, at least in a Christian congregation, is preaching and then talking to people. And I would imagine that takes up a tremendous amount of time. But it occurs to me that it might create some sort of awkward moments, maybe. I can imagine as preacher, all right, you're in the pulpit weekly. You have a certain sort of religious gravitas. You're an authoritative member of the community. And I guess people would see you as, I don't say you're judging, but there's always that kind of sense that the preacher is in a judging role in some sense. So then on Monday morning, a member of your congregation might come to you with a confidential matter. Is there ever a time where the preaching role and the counseling role might work against each other, or do you find people maybe hesitant to divulge private matters, for example? I don't know if I'm putting that clearly or not, but it occurs to me that maybe the two roles might not always go hand in hand.
Yeah. That's interesting. I as you were asking me that, I'm thinking of the other end when I'm out in public and somebody, you meet somebody for the first, what do you do? I'm a pastor. There's immediately,
Yeah, right.
you just sit up a little more in my chair now, or whatever it is. So yeah, there is that aspect of my vocation that brings with it a certain amount of expectation about what does it mean to be a pastor.
Right.
But back to your question, I think we live in a small town, and so of course it's as I'm speaking to people about personal issues, it's likely that sometimes their thing that they're dealing with right now is a part of a bigger problem that I'm aware of in the community, or they're dealing with people that I know as well. And so I obviously will try to divulge that in the beginning and say, well, just so you know, I do know that person. So it can get a little tricky in that way, especially in a smaller context where you're dealing with people who know each other.
Yeah.
Well.
And I would think it might be a little tricky from the other perspective. You mentioned that people react to you in a certain way when they know you're the minister. And I guess it's sometimes difficult for ministers to divulge their own vulnerabilities, right? You're supposed to have it all together all the time, right?
So I think some people have that expectation.
Right. Yeah. So I would imagine that you might, in order to demonstrate empathy at times, want to share something about your own personal life, but maybe it's difficult because of your role as a minister. I mean, that seems to be tricky as well. These are complex relationships.
No, absolutely. Absolutely, and that can be tricky. I think, and we were talking about training earlier. We talked about that in seminary and sort of the dangers of how much of a friend can you be to people that you're in a pastoral relationship with, and it's really hard. Yeah. As somebody naturally who is inclined to be empathetic and listening and caring, it's hard to sometimes to say, no, I'm going to keep this hat on right now, and as your pastor, I'm going to tell you that, blah, blah, blah. right?
Yeah.
As opposed to, no, I'm like, tell me what's going on, and oh, well, I've, in an attempt to create empathy and trust, relay a situation that I'd been in that might relate to them, and help build credibility and trust. And so that can be tricky sometimes.
Right.
Sure.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that there's no such thing as a typical week for a minister. But if you were to or if you were to describe a sort of typical week, particularly as, I mean, I know you spend a lot of time in sermon preparation if you happen to be preaching that week. But what sorts of things might you see in a typical week as a congregational care specialist?
Right. So it's usually, there are a certain number of things that I try to do regularly, whether it's weekly or monthly or whatever. I'm in touch with folks who particularly can't connect to the church. So a lot of our elderly folks are homebound. We have people who were a part of the church for a long time who now live in nursing homes or elsewhere. And so I help to manage a team of people who visit them regularly, and I also visit them as much as I can, just to say hi and check in and see how people are doing. So that's a kind of a regular part of pretty much every week. There's usually some kind of, somebody will drop by at some point and say, hey, can I have 5 minutes? And oftentimes that will be 5 minutes, oftentimes it'll be a lot longer, and we'll talk about some things that are going on in people's lives. It can be anything. As you said, every week is different.
Right.
I am a part of teaching a Sunday school class, or do Bible studies. I do other things that I'm preparing for to get ready for those tasks. And then other times it'll just be, I'll get a text. Hey, did you hear that so and so passed away, or did you know that so and so's in the hospital or having surgery tomorrow or whatever? And so there's a part of my job that I have to be reactive and flexible to be able to respond to things that are true crises and figure out how to care well in that situation, even if I'm doing other things at the moment.
Right.
How do I be responsive to the needs of a ever-changing congregation?
Yeah. I would imagine too that since a lot of your work would revolve around crisis or people in emotional distress, and since by your own admission you tend to be an empathetic person, I bet that there's particular weeks or months or even years when the burden gets pretty heavy.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how a minister deals with the kind of emotional stress that comes along with trying to minister to a group of people, a large group of people in your case.
Yeah.
Is that a real thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it does get to you at the end of the day sometimes.
It does.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, you think about the fact that I'm responding to crises a lot. That's a big part of what I do, and sometimes they're very serious. Somebody passed away, somebody's divorced, whatever, job loss. Those are real things that people are dealing with, and as I take that in and talk with them and work through it with them and listen, there's a part of that stays with me, right? And it's not something you can just shut off when you leave the office or whatever. It's not being a pastor is not a 9-to-5 job.
Right.
And so there are times when you get weary. And for me, some of the things that I try to do to navigate that are just making sure that I'm taking care of myself, physically, emotionally, having some time that I can set aside and say, okay, this is time where my phone is off right now for the next hour, whatever it is, and I'm going to have some space to recharge. I have a group of friends who are also pastors who live all throughout the country. We were in seminary together, and we are in constant communication with each other as things come up and situations arise that hey, what do you think about this? I had this happen today. And not being, of course, maintaining confidentiality, but helping process with each other what we're feeling and how we're responding to things. Right. That's a huge thing. Having somebody else that you can go to who understands what it's like to be a pastor and to be in that position.
To have that kind of emotional support group in a sense, but in an informal sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then I also was recently, I just came off of a sabbatical at my church. I had a 10-week sabbatical over the summer, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I realize not everybody gets a chance to do that, but that was hugely refreshing and life-giving for me. After 7 years of ministry at the church, 7 is a good biblical number. It felt like a good time to be taking a sabbatical. And so I'm really grateful for that time. And during that time, I spent time with my family. I spent time not thinking about church. I spent time reading. And I also did some continuing education and some spiritual growth and development through
that's wonderful. Through
coursework and study retreats and things like that too.
So you said continuing education in spiritual development? Is that a related field to?
Yeah.
to
So
congregate?
I started during sabbatical. I started it's a 3-year cohort that I'm taking with a group of 14 other pastors, lay leaders, people who are interested in a topic called spiritual direction, which is sitting with people, usually just one-on-one, helping them discern what God is up to in their lives. So it might be helping them think about their prayer life. It might be helping them think through what's going on around you. How are your relationships being formed? What's happening? What is God stirring in you right now? And helping them think through and pray through and be spiritually aware of what God is up to.
Now, we're in a university town. Does that present any special challenges in your role, or I know we have at your church there's another minister who works with young people. Does that other minister catch most of the university crowd, or is?
Yes and no. I've done some events and different things on campus from time to time to interact with. We all, as I said, it's also a smaller town, right? So I know that small is relative, but so we've all kind of had a chance to wear different hats. So I do interact some with students here on campus, not as much as our person who's more dedicated in that role.
Right. And one of the things you've done is a program called Stephen Ministries, and I know you brought that to your church. Could you tell me just a little bit about that as an example of the sort of formal programs that someone in your position might institute at a church?
So when I first started at my church, they had asked me to bring this program to the church, and it was Stephen Ministry it's a wonderful program. It is a training program for lay leaders in the congregation who, like me, felt like they had gifts for being empathetic and caring and listening, but didn't quite know what to do with them and how to use them well. And so Stephen Ministry is a program that provides 50 hours of training on a broad variety of topics, from caregiving through divorce, grief, suicide, you name it, job transitions, children, whatever. And it prepares you to deal one-on-one with somebody and walk with them through a time of crisis. And that could mean up to a year or two even, where you're in relationship with them. And so the training program itself is quite excellent. And we had a number of folks go through that program and become Stephen ministers in our church, and then be equipped to walk with folks through difficult times in their lives.
It sounds like the training program might have been more than you got in seminary. So you are more heavy duty, in fact.
In some ways it was, yeah.
Do you ever get in a point in counseling with someone, particularly someone in crisis, where you think, wait a minute, I've reached the end of what I can do for this person. Let's seek out help beyond.
I think that's probably one of the most important things for a minister to realize is when you have exhausted your ability to be helpful.
Right.
And so to know, to help people get to that point and realize that I'm not equipped to handle every situation, certainly at the depth of some of the crises that people are facing. And so knowing when to refer to someone else and how to manage that well is really critical.
I would imagine so. So in just a little bit of time we have left, what would you like to communicate to people about what you would like for them to understand about a minister and a minister's role? Just the challenges or the understandings or whatever might come to mind.
Yeah, I think it's really tough because everybody has, we alluded to this earlier, everybody has a different idea about what it means to be a pastor. Right. And so everybody has different expectations about when they come to you with an issue. And so that's part of my job too, is to discern what are you actually looking for here? Do you need somebody to listen to you? Do you need someone to refer you to someone else? Do you need me to fix your problem? Like what are you expecting from me?
Well, that might be it, right? That you don't always have all the answers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's being a minister, being a rabbi, being a religious leader of whatever faith one finds themselves in. It's got to be the most challenging job I can think of, and I thank you for being so diligent and faithful in your work, and other people like you. It's important work you do in the community, and I appreciate you coming on today to talk about it.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. And thank you. That's Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us next week on App TV when we'll take a new look at an all-American holiday, Thanksgiving. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.